He wasn't supposed to be adopted. The tag on the kennel door said it in quiet, final ink. Retired canine. Dangerous. Do not approach. Inside, the dog didn't bark. He didn't pace. He didn't beg for a second chance the way the others did. He just sat there, still as stone, eyes open but distant, like a soldier who had already said goodbye to something no one else could see. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glow across the concrete floor, and the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with damp fur hung in the air, sharp and cold. 48 hours, that's what the clipboard said. 48 hours before the system decided his story was finished. No ceremony, no witness, just a quiet door closing somewhere in the back. The volunteers walked past his kennel slower than the others, not out of curiosity, but caution. They spoke in lowered voices when they mentioned him, like his name alone might trigger something unseen. Rex. That was the only thing left on his record that sounded like he belonged to someone once. A retired police dog. 5 years of service. Commendations. Then one line that erased it all. Incident with handler. No details. No context. Just a label heavy enough to bury everything good that came before it. And so he waited. Not for rescue. Not for forgiveness. Just waited. As if time itself had slowed around him, stretching each second into something heavier, something harder to carry. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped low, brushing the shelter windows with a tired golden light that never quite reached his corner. The world kept moving. Cars passed. People laughed somewhere far beyond those walls. But inside that kennel, there was only silence. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of things unsaid, unseen, misunderstood. And then, footsteps. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, measured, different. They didn't stop at the front where the friendly dogs wagged their tails and pressed their noses against the bars. They didn't pause at the middle rows where hopeful eyes followed every movement. They kept going, deeper, toward the back, toward him. The man didn't see the warning signs. Not the bold red letters. Not the stiff posture of the volunteers who suddenly held their breath. He couldn't, because the man walking toward Rex had not seen anything in years. Daniel Hayes moved with careful precision, his boots soft against the concrete, guided by memory more than sight. 38 years old. A veteran who once navigated chaos with clarity, now navigating silence with instinct. The world had gone dark for him long before this moment, but something about this place, it felt heavier. Like grief had a scent, like loneliness echoed differently here. He paused mid-step, his head tilted back there. He is not like the others, and Daniel did not turn, did not step away. He simply listened, the way he had learned to listen after the world went dark, with his whole body, with the small shifts in tone, the pauses between words, the things people did not say. And the volunteer continued, her voice lowering. He used to be a police dog. Something happened. They say he is unpredictable. And the word lingered in the air, heavy, incomplete, like a sentence missing its truth. And Daniel exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of a smile touching one corner of his mouth. Not because he found it amusing, but because he recognized it. That label, that quiet judgment placed on something people no longer tried to understand. And he tilted his head slightly toward the kennel. What is his name? He asked, his voice calm, steady, the kind that did not rush, and the volunteer hesitated, as if even saying it carried weight. Rex, she replied, and the name seemed to settle between them. Simple, strong, unfinished, and inside the kennel, the dog's ears shifted just slightly, not fully upright, not alert in the way trained instincts would demand, but aware, present. And Daniel took one careful step forward, then another, his boots making the softest sound against the floor, until he stood just inches from the metal barrier that separated them, and for a moment, neither moved, not the man, not the dog, not the people watching from a distance who felt something change but could not explain why. And Daniel slowly lowered his cane, letting it rest against his leg, and extended his hand forward, not reaching into the kennel, not forcing contact, just offering space, open, patient, waiting, and the air between them seemed to tighten, like a held breath stretching across seconds. And Rex did not lunge, did not retreat. He simply looked, his amber eyes fixed not on the man's hand, but on his face, as if searching for something deeper than sight, something beyond movement, beyond instinct, and Daniel spoke again, softer this time, almost to himself. "You are not dangerous, are you?" And there was no accusation in it, no challenge, just a quiet question shaped by experience. And somewhere in that stillness, Rex shifted his weight forward, one deliberate step, slow enough that it barely made a sound, and then another, until he stood close to the gate, his breath steady, his posture controlled, and he lowered his head just slightly, not in submission, not in fear, but in something that looked almost like recognition. And the volunteer behind Daniel inhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the clipboard, because this was not how it usually went. This was not how it ever went, and Daniel felt it, not through sight, but through presence, through the subtle warmth of another living thing choosing not to pull away. And his fingers trembled for just a fraction of a second before stilling, and then, gently, carefully, he moved his hand closer, until there was only a few inches of air left between them. And in that final space, something shifted again, something quiet and unseen. And Rex closed the distance first, pressing his nose lightly against Daniel's hand. A touch so soft it could have been imagined, but it was real, steady, intentional, and Daniel's breath caught, not from surprise, but from something deeper, something he had not felt in a long time. And the world around them seemed to fade. The hum of the lights, the distant barking, the quiet whispers of the volunteers, all of it pulling back until there was only that single point of contact. A man who could not see, and a dog the world had given up on, meeting in the only way that mattered. Without fear, without judgment, just presence, just trust beginning where nothing else had worked. The contact did not break right away, and that was what made it different. Because most moments like this were quick, uncertain, fragile, but this one lingered, stretching into something steadier, something that did not rush to prove itself. And Daniel slowly curled his fingers just slightly, enough to feel the warmth of the dog's breath against his skin, the soft exhale that carried no tension, no warning, just presence. And he let out a quiet breath of his own, as if matching it, as if learning the rhythm of something he had not known he was missing. And behind him, the volunteer shifted again, her voice barely above a whisper. "He has never done that before." And Daniel nodded once, not surprised, not impressed, just certain, because there was a difference between what people expected and what something truly was. And he spoke softly, still facing forward. Maybe no one asked him the right way. And the words settled into the space like something older than the moment itself, something earned, not guessed. And Rex did not move away, did not pull back into the corner where he had spent so many silent hours. Instead, he remained close, his posture grounded, his weight balanced in that quiet way trained dogs carried themselves, always ready, always aware, but now, choosing stillness instead of distance. And Daniel slowly withdrew his hand, not abruptly, not testing limits, just easing back as if to say the connection did not need to be forced to remain. And Rex's head followed the motion just slightly, not enough to reach again, but enough to acknowledge the absence. And that small movement was enough for Daniel to understand something deeper, something unspoken, and he turned his head just a fraction toward the volunteer. "Can you open it?" he asked, his voice calm, without hesitation, and the air behind him tightened instantly, because that request carried weight, risk, responsibility, and the volunteer hesitated, her training pressing against her instinct. "Sir, I do not think that is a good idea," she replied carefully. "We have protocols for a reason." And Daniel nodded slowly, understanding the concern, but not stepping away from his decision. "I understand," he said, "but I am not asking because I think it is safe. I am asking because I think he is not what you believe he is." And the words landed gently, but firmly, and for a moment, no one spoke, because sometimes truth did not arrive loudly. It arrived quietly and asked to be trusted. And Rex remained where he was, not reacting to the tension in the room, not shifting into alertness, just waiting, the same way he had been waiting before Daniel ever walked in. But now that waiting felt different, less like resignation, more like choice, and the volunteer looked down at the clipboard in her hands, then back at the kennel, then at Daniel, weighing policy against something she could not quite explain, and finally, with a slow breath, she reached for the keys at her side, the faint metallic sound cutting softly through the silence. And as she stepped forward, she spoke again, quieter now. If anything feels wrong, we stop immediately. And Daniel gave a small nod. Already still, already listening, and the lock clicked once, then again. And the kennel door opened just a few inches, enough to change the air, enough to shift the invisible line that had kept them apart, and Rex did not rush forward, did not seize the opening. He simply remained where he was, eyes steady, body calm, waiting for something more important than freedom, waiting for permission, and Daniel felt it, that pause, that discipline, that choice. And he took one slow step forward into the space, closing the distance not with confidence, but with respect. And for the first time in a long time, the darkness around him did not feel empty. It felt shared, like someone else was standing inside it with him, not trying to lead, not trying to control, just there, present. And Rex moved then, one quiet step closer, matching the man's pace, not ahead, not behind, just beside. And in that small, measured movement, something fragile began to take shape, not trust fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of it, the kind that does not demand, does not prove, it simply grows, one quiet moment at a time. The space inside the kennel felt different once the door was no longer a barrier, not larger, not brighter, but quieter in a way that settled deeper. And Daniel stood there for a moment without moving, allowing himself to adjust, not to the physical space, but to the presence beside him, because presence had weight, it had shape, it had a way of filling silence with something meaningful, and Rex remained just a step away, close enough that Daniel could feel the faint shift of air with each breath, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like uncertainty, but choice. And slowly, carefully, Daniel lowered himself down, one knee first, then the other, until he was kneeling on the cool concrete floor, bringing himself level with the dog not out of necessity, but respect. And his hand moved again, this time not hesitating at the edge, but resting gently along Rex's neck, fingers brushing through the thick fur, feeling the warmth beneath, the steady life that did not pull away. And Rex did not flinch, did not stiffen. He simply stood there, accepting the contact the way a trained partner once would, not as affection, but as acknowledgement. And Daniel let his hand remain there, grounding himself in that moment. Because there was something about this dog that did not ask for sympathy, did not seek approval. It simply existed with a kind of quiet dignity that Daniel recognized all too well. And after a few seconds, he spoke, his voice low, thoughtful. "They said you made a mistake." And the words were not sharp, not accusatory, just curious. And Rex's ears shifted slightly, not in reaction to the meaning, but to the tone, as if he understood something beyond language. And Daniel continued, his hand still resting lightly against him. "I know what that feels like." And that sentence carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it was not about the dog anymore. It was about something deeper, something shared. And the volunteer standing just outside the kennel watched closely, her breath slow, controlled, waiting for something to change, for something to go wrong. But nothing did, because sometimes the most important moments did not announce themselves. They unfolded quietly, without urgency, without spectacle. And Daniel shifted slightly, sitting back on his heel, his posture relaxed in a way it had not been since he walked into the building. And Rex mirrored that calm, lowering himself to the ground with a controlled motion, not curling into the corner, not distancing himself, but settling beside Daniel, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. And that small, simple act carried more meaning than any command ever could. Because it was not obedience, it was choice. And Daniel felt it immediately, the subtle change in the air, the absence of tension, the presence of something steadier, something reliable. And he allowed himself a small exhale, one that released more than just breath. And after a moment, he reached forward again, this time tracing his fingers along the side of Rex's collar, feeling the worn edges, the faint scratches that spoke of years of use. And there was a tag there, small, metal, cool against his fingertips. And he turned it slightly, not to read, but to feel its shape, its weight. And he smiled faintly. "You had a job," he murmured. And there was something in his tone that carried respect, not pity. And Rex's tail moved once, slow, controlled, barely lifting from the ground before settling again. And that was enough. Enough to say something had shifted, something had been acknowledged. And outside the kennel, The volunteer finally let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, her grip loosening on the clipboard, because whatever this was, it was not what she had expected, not what the reports had warned her about. And yet, there it was, unfolding quietly in front of her. A man who could not see, and a dog no one trusted, sitting side by side as if neither of those things mattered, as if the labels had been left somewhere outside the room. And Daniel tilted his head slightly, listening again, not to the building, not to the distant sounds, but to the silence between them. And for the first time in a long time, that silence did not feel empty, it felt shared. The stillness lingered longer than anyone expected, stretching into something that felt less like a moment and more like a quiet decision being made without words. And Daniel slowly shifted his weight, pressing one hand against the floor as he rose back to his feet. Careful, deliberate, his movements shaped by memory and instinct rather than sight. And Rex stood with him, not a second too early, not a second too late, matching the rise with a precision that did not feel trained, but understood. And for a brief second, they stood side by side in that small space, neither leading, neither following, just existing in the same rhythm. And Daniel reached for his cane again, fingers brushing the familiar handle, grounding himself in something known, something steady. And as he adjusted his grip, Rex moved slightly closer, just enough that the distance between them disappeared, his shoulder aligning near Daniel's leg, not touching, but present. And the volunteer noticed it immediately, the subtle positioning, the awareness, the quiet readiness that spoke of years of discipline. And she stepped forward carefully, her voice gentle but cautious. "Sir, we should step out now." And Daniel nodded once, understanding, and turned slightly toward the open kennel door. But before he took a step, he paused, sensing rather than seeing that Rex had not moved ahead, had not rushed past the threshold. And Daniel gave a small exhale, something close to a quiet smile. "You are waiting," he said softly, not asking, not commanding, just recognizing. And Rex remained exactly where he was, steady, patient, as if the invisible line at the doorway still held meaning. And Daniel took one slow step forward, crossing that line first. And only then did Rex follow, one step behind, controlled, measured, his paws making almost no sound against the concrete. And the volunteer watched closely, her eyes tracking every movement, every shift, expecting at any second for something unpredictable to break through. But nothing did, because unpredictability did not always mean danger. Sometimes it meant something misunderstood. And as they moved into the corridor, the sounds of the shelter returned, distant barking, faint voices, the hum of lights, but none of it disrupted the quiet space that seemed to travel with them. And Daniel stopped again after a few steps, turning his head slightly as if orienting himself, and Rex adjusted instantly, shifting position just enough to remain beside him, not pulling, not guiding yet, but aware, always aware. And Daniel spoke again, this time more certain. "How long has he been here?" And the volunteer answered after a brief pause. 3 weeks, her voice softer now, less guarded. No one wanted to take the risk, and Daniel nodded slowly, absorbing the words not as information, but as something heavier, something familiar. And he let out a quiet breath. 3 weeks is a long time to wait for someone to see you. And there was no bitterness in his tone, only understanding. And Rex's ears flicked once, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if something in that sentence reached him in a way that words alone could not. And the volunteer stepped closer, lowering her voice again. "If you are serious about taking him, there are forms, evaluations, a process." And Daniel did not hesitate, did not ask for more time. "I am serious," he said, his voice calm, grounded, carrying the weight of a decision already made. And for the first time since he entered the shelter, there was no uncertainty in his posture, no searching, no hesitation, just quiet resolve. And Rex remained beside him, still, composed, as if he understood that something had shifted beyond this room, beyond this moment, something that would not be undone easily. And the volunteer studied them both for a long second, the man who could not see and the dog no one trusted, standing together in a way that made the rest of the world feel slightly off balance. And she nodded slowly, almost to herself. "Then we start now," she said. And as she turned to lead the way down the corridor, Daniel took a step forward, and this time, without being asked, Without a command, Rex moved with him, not behind, not ahead, but exactly where he needed to be, as if he had already chosen his place long before anyone else believed he could. The corridor felt longer on the way out, not because the distance had changed, but because something had, something subtle but undeniable, and Daniel walked with a steadiness that had not been there before, his steps still careful, still measured, but no longer searching in the same uncertain way, and beside him, Rex moved in quiet alignment, not brushing against him, not pulling ahead, just maintaining that precise position where presence could be felt without being forced, and the volunteer led them toward a small office near the front, her footsteps quick but controlled, as if she was still adjusting to what she had just witnessed, still trying to fit it into something familiar, something explainable, and when they reached the doorway, she stepped aside, allowing Daniel to enter first, and he paused briefly at the threshold, his head tilting slightly as he took in the shift in space, the faint scent of paper and coffee, the softer hum of a smaller room, and he stepped inside, Rex following only after him. The same pattern, the same discipline, and the volunteer closed the door gently behind them, the quiet click sealing the moment into something more official, more real, and she moved to the desk, setting down her clipboard, flipping through pages that carried rules, requirements, decisions made long before this one, and Daniel stood near the center of the room, his hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, grounding himself, while Rex settled beside him without being asked, lowering to the floor in a controlled motion, his body angled slightly toward the door, always aware, always positioned with purpose, and the volunteer glanced at him, then at the forms in her hands, and she spoke carefully. "There are things you should know before we go any further." And Daniel nodded once, already listening, already prepared. And she continued, "His record is incomplete. We do not have full details about the incident, only that it ended his service, and the words were chosen with care, not to alarm, but not to hide." And Daniel absorbed them quietly, not reacting immediately, because he understood something about incomplete stories, about how a single line could erase everything that came before it. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice steady. "Sometimes the part they leave out is the part that matters most." And the volunteer paused, her pen hovering above the paper, because that sentence did not challenge her, it shifted something, and she looked down again, turning a page. "He will need evaluation. Behavioral observation. You will need to demonstrate that you can handle him," she said, and Daniel let out a small breath, not frustration, not resistance, just acknowledgement. "That sounds fair," he replied, and his hand moved slightly, fingers brushing the edge of the chair, then lowering slowly toward Rex, resting briefly against the dog's shoulder, and Rex did not move, did not react. He simply remained, steady, grounded, as if that contact confirmed something already decided, and the volunteer watched them both, her expression softening just a fraction, because what she was seeing did not fit the warnings, did not match the reports, and yet, she could not ignore what was in front of her, and she nodded slowly, more to herself than to them. "We can begin with a simple test," she said, setting the forms aside, and she reached for a leash on the desk, holding it out carefully, not to Rex, but to Daniel, and there was a pause, a small, quiet moment where the weight of that simple object seemed heavier than it should, because it represented control, responsibility, trust, and Daniel accepted it without hesitation, his fingers closing around the handle with familiarity, not because he had done this before with this dog, but because he understood what it meant to hold something you could not fully predict, and he lowered the leash slowly, allowing it to rest near Rex without forcing it, without command. And for a brief second, nothing happened, the room holding its breath again. And then Rex lifted his head, eyes calm, posture steady, and he leaned forward just enough for the leash to be placed over him, not resisting, not questioning, just accepting, and Daniel exhaled quietly, a small release that carried something deeper than relief, something closer to recognition, and the volunteer watched closely, her pen forgotten, her expectations shifting with every second, because this was no longer about policy or procedure, it was about something she could not write down, something she could only witness. And as Daniel adjusted his grip on the leash, standing a little straighter, a little more certain, Rex rose with him, aligning once again at his side, and in that simple movement, Something unspoken became clear, not fully formed, not yet proven, but undeniable, that this was not a pairing built on control. It was something else, something quieter, something stronger, something that did not need to be forced to exist. The leash rested lightly in Daniel's hand, not pulled tight, not slack, just present, and for a moment, nothing else moved, as if the room itself was waiting to see what would happen next, and the volunteer stepped back slightly, giving them space. Her voice quieter now, more observant than instructive. "Just walk with him," she said, and Daniel nodded once, turning his body toward the open floor, his movements slow but deliberate, guided by memory and instinct. And he took a single step forward, the soft tap of his boot against the floor echoing gently in the small room, and Rex moved at the exact same moment, not a second before, not a second after, aligning himself at Daniel's left side with a precision that did not feel rehearsed. It felt remembered, and Daniel paused, sensing the shift, the presence beside him matching his own rhythm, and he took another step, then another, each one measured, each one steady, and Rex stayed with him, not pulling ahead, not lagging behind, just there, constant, grounded, and the leash between them remained loose, untouched by tension, a simple line that no longer needed to control anything, and the volunteer watched closely, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, because what she was seeing did not match the reports she had read, did not align with the warnings she had repeated so many times before, and Daniel continued walking, slowly circling the room, his hand steady on the leash, his posture beginning to shift, becoming more upright, more certain, as if something inside him was adjusting to this new presence, this quiet alignment, and Rex mirrored it all, every turn, every pause, every slight change in direction, responding not to commands, but to intention, to movement, to something deeper than instruction, and after a few moments, Daniel stopped, his head tilting slightly, listening again, not to the room, but to Rex, to the subtle cues that existed without sound, and he spoke softly, almost as if testing something. "Stay." And he took a small step back, the leash still loose in his hand, and Rex remained exactly where he was, unmoving, steady, his focus forward, his posture calm, and Daniel waited, counting something silently in his mind, then stepped forward again, closing the distance, and Rex shifted just enough to realign beside him. The movement smooth, controlled, natural, and the volunteer exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly, because this was not coincidence, this was not luck, this was something else, something she could not easily explain, and she stepped closer, her voice softer now, less guarded. "Try turning without signaling," she suggested, and Daniel nodded, adjusting his stance, and without warning, he pivoted gently to the right, his movement subtle, almost imperceptible, and Rex adjusted instantly, matching the turn with the same quiet precision, staying at his side as if the change had been announced long before it happened, and Daniel paused again, his grip on the leash loosening even further, because he did not need it, not really, and he let out a small breath, something close to relief, something close to trust, and he spoke again, quieter this time. "You already know." And there was no question in his voice, just recognition, and Rex's tail moved once, slow and controlled. A small acknowledgement that carried more meaning than any command ever could, and the volunteer stood still, watching them, her clipboard forgotten on the desk behind her, because what she was seeing was not a test being passed. It was something being revealed, something that had always been there, but had never been given the space to show itself. And Daniel took one final step forward, then stopped, his body settling into stillness, and Rex settled with him. The two of them standing side by side in quiet alignment, the leash hanging loose between them, no longer a tool, just a symbol of something that had already begun to form, something that did not need force, did not need proof. It simply existed, steady and undeniable. The room had grown quieter, not because the sounds had faded, but because something inside it had settled, like a tension that no longer needed to exist, and Daniel stood still for a long moment, his hand loosely holding the leash, his breathing slow, even, as if he was adjusting not just to the presence beside him, but to a feeling he had not allowed himself in a long time. And the volunteer finally spoke again, her voice softer than before, no longer guarded by procedure, "There is one more thing," she said, and Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, listening. And she hesitated for just a second, as if deciding how much truth to offer. "The report about the incident," she continued. "It says he reacted before anyone else saw the problem. That is all it says." And the words hung in the air, incomplete, like everything else about Rex's past. And Daniel absorbed them quietly, not asking for more, because sometimes the absence of detail said more than the detail itself, and his fingers tightened just slightly around the leash, not from tension, but from understanding, and he nodded once. He was doing his job, he said simply. And the volunteer did not respond right away, because the way he said it made it sound less like a guess, and more like a certainty. And she looked at Rex, really looked this time, not as a risk, not as a liability, but as something else entirely. And for the first time since he arrived, the label in her mind began to loosen, just a little, and Daniel shifted his stance, turning slightly toward the door, and Rex adjusted instantly, aligning beside him again without being asked, and Daniel took a slow step forward, then another, moving toward the exit, and the volunteer opened the door ahead of them, stepping aside, no longer leading, just allowing. And as they stepped back into the corridor, the sounds of the shelter returned more clearly now, the distant barking, the faint hum of activity, but none of it seemed to disrupt the quiet space that surrounded them. And Daniel paused once more, his head tilting slightly as if orienting himself. And then he spoke, not to the volunteer, not even fully to Rex, but into the space between them. "You saw something no one else did." And Rex's ears shifted, subtle, controlled, and Daniel gave a faint exhale, something close to acceptance, and they continued forward, walking slowly down the corridor, the leash still loose, still unnecessary. And as they passed the rows of kennels, some dogs barked, some pressed against the bars, but Rex did not react, did not turn his head. His focus remained steady, his presence anchored beside Daniel. And Daniel noticed it, not through sight, but through absence, through the lack of distraction, and his posture straightened just slightly, his steps becoming more confident, more certain. And when they reached the front of the shelter, the light changed, brighter now, warmer, filtering in through the glass doors, and Daniel stopped just before the threshold, as if sensing the shift, as if recognizing that stepping outside would mean something more than just leaving the building. And he lowered his head slightly, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "I do not need you to be perfect," he said, his hand resting briefly against Rex's shoulder. "I just need you to be honest." And the words were not a command, not a condition, just a truth offered freely, and Rex remained still, grounded, his presence steady in a way that did not need to be proven. And the volunteer stood a few feet behind them, watching, her clipboard still untouched, because whatever process had been followed, whatever rules had been applied, something else had already taken place, something she could not document, something she could only witness. And Daniel took one final step forward, crossing the threshold into the light, and Rex followed immediately, not hesitating, not holding back, stepping into that same space without resistance. And for a brief moment, as the door closed softly behind them, it felt as though something had been left inside, not the dog, not the man, but the weight of what they had been before this moment. And outside, the air felt different, open, unconfined, carrying the faint scent of the street, distant traffic, the world continuing as it always had. But for Daniel, something had shifted, something small, something quiet, something that did not need to be seen to be real. The air outside carried a different kind of silence, not the enclosed stillness of walls and fluorescent lights, but something wider, something open, where sounds drifted instead of echoing. And Daniel stood just beyond the shelter doors, his face turned slightly upward, as if feeling the warmth of the late afternoon sun against his skin. And for a moment, he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he was allowing the moment to settle, to become real. And beside him, Rex remained steady, his posture unchanged, his presence as grounded out here as it had been inside, as if location did not define him, as if purpose did. And Daniel slowly adjusted his grip on the leash, though it still hung loose, untouched by tension, and he took a careful step forward onto the sidewalk, the texture beneath his boots shifting slightly, and Rex moved with him, matching the change in surface without hesitation, without confusion, his awareness extending beyond walls, beyond rooms, into the open world, and Daniel paused. Again after a few steps, his head tilting just slightly, listening, sensing the rhythm of the street, the distant hum of passing cars, the faint rustle of leaves carried by a light breeze, and for the first time in a long time, none of it felt overwhelming, none of it felt distant, because there was something beside him now, something steady, something present, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in months, and his hand moved down, resting briefly against Rex's back, not searching, not questioning, just confirming, and Rex remained calm, accepting the touch without shifting his focus, his body aligned with Daniel's in a way that no longer felt new. It felt natural, and they began to walk again, slowly at first. Then with a growing confidence, Daniel's steps becoming more fluid, less hesitant, as if the space around him had become clearer, not through sight, but through trust, and Rex stayed with him, adjusting subtly with every movement, every pause, every change in direction, responding not to commands, but to intention, to presence, to something deeper than training. And as they reached the edge of the sidewalk, Daniel stopped, sensing the slight change in elevation, and before he could shift his weight forward, Rex gently stepped just half a pace ahead, not pulling, not forcing, just positioning himself in a way that created a quiet boundary, and Daniel felt it immediately. The subtle cue, the unspoken signal, and he nodded once, more to himself than to anyone else, and adjusted his step accordingly. And in that small moment, something became clear, something that did not need explanation, that what had been labeled as unpredictable was not chaos. It was awareness. It was instinct sharpened by purpose, misunderstood by those who had not taken the time to see it. And Daniel continued forward, stepping off the curb with care, and Rex moved with him, steady, controlled, guiding without leading, supporting without taking over. And on the other side, Daniel paused again, his breath steady, his posture upright, and he spoke softly, his voice carrying a quiet certainty now. You were never the problem, and the words were not spoken with anger, not directed at anyone, just released into the open air like something finally understood, and Rex's tail moved once, slow and deliberate. A simple acknowledgement that did not ask for recognition, did not need validation, and they continued walking down the street, side by side. The leash still loose, still unnecessary, because whatever connection had begun inside those walls had followed them out into the world, unchanged, unbroken, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows,